Welcome back to Channel 6. We have a very special documentary for you guys. Hope you enjoy it.
The Korean War was fought between North and South Korea over communism.
June 20th, 1950, the Cold War between the Russians and the U.S. created tensions due to the spread of communism throughout North Korea.
Russians used a tactic called the domino theory. If one country becomes communist, all neighboring countries will become communist.
His goal throughout the Korean War was to contain communism, because if South Korea fell under communist control, then the rest of Southeast Asia would surrender under communism as well, which wasn't the goal of the U.S.
25th, 1950, Joseph Stalin agreed for the North Korean troops to invade South Korea.
After the invasion, Harry Truman's proposal to the United Nations to send American troops into South Korea was approved.
In October of 1950, American United Nations forces marched across the 38th parallel with the thought of pushing out the North Koreans and to unify Korea.
As a result of the counterattack, China sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops to Korea, which successfully pushed back the United Nations forces across the 38th parallel line.
3 long years of fighting, an armistice was signed in 1953. The division of the two countries along the 38th parallel still remained.
In the 1970s, tensions decreased tremendously. Up to the Korean War, tensions between the U.S. and Russians sparked the Korean War. But by the 1970s, tensions have decreased tremendously.
Once Chinese communists came to power, the U.S. and the United Nations feared the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia.
Also, to make fears greater among anti-communists, the Soviet Union and China signed a pact which unified the two largest communist nations in the world.
For this pact, among China and the Soviet Union, the Soviets and the United States were on high tensions due to the difference between political standpoints.
The United States saw how communism affected the Soviet Union and its neighboring communist countries. As a result, the U.S. has never leaned towards communism.
Harry S. Truman was so against communism that he drafted the Truman Doctrine, which stated the United States would provide money to countries under the communist threats.
A few years after World War II and before the Korean War, democratic leaders wanted to establish Southeast Asia.
But when economies failed in Southeast Asia, this opened doors for communist rulers to take over and reform the economy.
The U.S. encouraged free trade throughout the whole world, but the Soviets wanted to cut themselves off from any other source of trade with other countries.
With the Second World War, Korea was neutral and a common government had been reached. With Russia being communist and the U.S. a democracy, tensions began to get hotter and hotter.
During the outbreak in the Korean War, MacArthur was appointed commander of the United Nations forces. On September 15th of 1950, MacArthur and thousands of United Nations forces landed at Lincoln, which is about 200 miles behind the Korean lines.
President Truman and Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, told General MacArthur to limit the war to Korea. But since some Chinese were against the United Nations forces, MacArthur was obliged to not take them out.
In April of 1951, MacArthur was removed from his command of the United Nations forces in Korea.
The arrival back to the United States, MacArthur led a campaign against Harry S. Truman and his Democratic Party.
MacArthur left the United States Army. He accepted a job as a chairman of the board of the Remington Rand Corporation.
Douglas MacArthur died on April 5, 1964, in Washington.
June of the year 2000, leaders of North and South Korea took part in a North-South summit.
still sends their money into military whilst having a very poor economy.
Result to a poor economy, as many as 2 million people have died as a result of the food shortages since the mid-1990s. The Korean War was fought through the years of 1950 to 1953.
Since the split among countries, North Korea is a strict communist party in which military is its only power. On the other hand, South Korea has become democratic and does not suffer from the creation of a communist leader.
The Korean War has left thousands of people heartbroken, stranded, and as enemies.
With Kim Jong-il being their present-day leader, tensions among North and South Korea are still fuming.
Overall, if the U.S. didn't fight the North Koreans, communism may have spread and taken over the whole world, which would have made it very bad.
In June of 2000, both the leaders from North and South Korea signed a joint declaration during the first North-South Summit. They also stated the second summit meeting wouldn't be held until an appropriate time. Well, that appropriate time was October 2nd, 2007. Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il talked during meetings and discussions. They discussed issues about South Korea and North Korea relations and unification of Korea. On October 4, 2007, Kim Jong-il and Roh Moo-hyun signed a peace treaty. Looking back on what started the Korean War and how the tensions between the United States and Russia helped fuel the fire to create more tensions among Koreans was very, very interesting to learn about in a way, because we learned that in the Cold War the Russians and the Americans were very, very, very different because of the government. The way to control our government was very different because the Russians wanted communism and the United States wanted a Western democracy. But knowing that the Russians sent, after World War II, the Russians were in North Korea and the Americans and United Nations forces were in South Korea, we fought the Russians because we didn't want the spread of communism to overtake the world, and that would just make it so much worse for everyone. Ever since the Korean War, North and South Korea have been on somewhat understanding terms, but since 2007, when the second summit meeting was adjourned, there have been a few conspiracy theories.